In April of 1966, during a routine post-winter inspection in a remote section of Dixie National Forest in southern Utah, 35 kilometers east of Cedar City, in a region of red sandstone plateau where deep canyons cut the terrain into a labyrinth of formations that complete surveys have never adequately mapped, Senior Ranger Dorothy Hawkins, 41 years old with 12 years in the Forest Service, and Ranger Bill Santos, 33 years old with 6 years in the service, made a discovery that has now passed through more than 3 decades of academic investigation without resolution. Hawkins knew this section better than anyone alive. She had a cartographic memory of the terrain colleagues described as nearly photographic. If anything was different in a landscape she noticed. That is what happened on the 16th of April. She and Santos were inspecting a sandstone slope along an unnamed canyon, checking for post-snow erosion. She was looking at a sandstone wall 20 meters from her position when she noticed a shadow that should not have been there. The sandstone of this region in late afternoon April light has a specific pattern of brightness and shadow Hawkins had internalized over 12 years. The shadow she saw was inconsistent with what her memory said should have been there. Too dark, too localized, shaped like an opening rather than a depression. She called Santos over and pointed. What the shadow marked was the mouth of a cave, an opening 1.5 meters tall by 2 meters wide, masked by an overhanging outcropping that created such a viewing angle that the opening was invisible from any position other than the specific one where Hawkins had been standing. Not merely difficult to see, geometrically invisible from every other approach angle along the canyon, as if the opening had been positioned to be visible only from a specific direction under a specific lighting condition. Hawkins entered first with a flashlight. Santos followed. An initial corridor of 5 meters opened into a chamber, whose dimensions both initially misjudged. The chamber seemed small until their eyes adjusted to the illumination, and they perceived that the ceiling rose beyond the reach of the beam, and that the side walls receded further than first impression suggested. The chamber was at least 15 meters in diameter, with a ceiling Santos estimated at 10 meters at the highest point. The walls had paintings, not the typical petroglyphs of Utah, not the stylized anthropomorphic figures of the Fremont or ancestral Puebloan tradition Hawkins recognized from 12 years of work in a region with abundant rock art. What covered the walls in such a way that it left no centimeter of surface without imagery was something different in scale, in technique, and in content from anything either had ever seen. The pigment came in multiple colors, not only the ochre and black of mineral pigments typical of prehistoric rock art, but variations of red, of orange, of white, of a blue-gray, and tones Hawkins could not name precisely because of the way they absorbed and reflected the flashlight light in an unconventional manner. The content was what stopped Hawkins entirely. What covered the walls was a map, not a simple map. A complex cartographic system of multiple layers, with elements Hawkins, a woman of applied scientific training, recognized as topographic representations, as drainage lines, and as what appeared to be coordinates in a system that was not the system of any map she had ever used. Santos pointed to a specific section of the east wall. The paintings there had a different quality, not in pigment or technique, but in content. Instead of cartographic elements, there were figures in a form Santos later described as suggested human rather than represented human, like someone who understood the concept of a human figure, but was working from description rather than from observation. And around those figures, in a pattern that seemed narrative, a sequence of events rather than a static composition, there were elements neither could interpret, but which both recognized as having narrative intent. They spent 40 minutes documenting with a notebook and the Kodak camera Santos carried for fieldwork. They reported the discovery to the district supervisor, Walter Morrison, who sent a telegram to the University of Utah requesting an archaeological consultant. The university responded within 4 days by sending Dr. James Park, 48 years old, a professor of archaeology specializing in southwestern rock art, with 20 years of field experience. Park arrived on the 26th of April. Hawkins led him to the cave. Park entered and remained in silence for 20 minutes, examining the paintings with a high-powered flashlight. When he came out, his expression was, in Hawkins's later description, that of a man who walked in expecting to classify and walked out unable to classify. He told them he did not know what it was, that he could only say what it was not Fremont, not ancestral Puebloan, not archaic period, that it did not correspond to any documented rock art tradition in the Southwest or anywhere else he knew. Park spent 3 days in the cave with 2 doctoral students he summoned from Salt Lake. They collected pigment samples for laboratory analysis. Park attempted dating by analysis of the rock varnish layer over the pigment, a standard technique that uses the accumulation of organic mineral deposits to estimate minimum age. The varnish over the paintings was undetectable, so thin that it provided no dating data. Park interpreted this as evidence that the paintings were recent, a century or less. But recent did not explain the cartographic system. Recent did not explain figures that corresponded to no known art tradition of any period. The laboratory analysis produced a result Park described as anomalous and inconclusive. The pigments were of mineral origin, but the specific mineral composition did not match known pigment sources in Utah or in the broader Southwest. More troubling was that the blue-gray Hawkins had noticed, for its unusual way of absorbing light, contained compounds the laboratory could not fully identify. A compound genuinely present in a pigment that corresponded to no natural substance known in the geological literature consulted. Park published a preliminary article in 1967 describing the cave as a site of exceptional interest, undatable by current methods, unattributable to any known cultural tradition. The article generated moderate academic interest. The linguist who heard about the cartographic system was Dr. Patricia Morse, 40 years old, of the University of Arizona, who spent 5 days in the cave in 1968 examining the elements Park had called cartographic. The cartographic system had a structure consistent with representational systems developed by cultures with sophisticated mathematical capability, a system with conventions, scales, and symbols that implied a systematized body of knowledge. But it did not correspond to any known cartography of any documented civilization in any historical period. Not Mesoamerican, not from any culture of the Old World, not from any Native American tradition of North America. The narrative section Santos had noticed received particular attention from Morse. The sequence of figures, read in the direction Morse determined to be correct, based on internal compositional patterns, appeared to describe arrival. Figures arriving at a place, not figures inhabiting a place, and the place being arrived at had characteristics Morse noted carefully. Structures the painting suggested but did not clearly represent. A geographic position the surrounding cartographic paintings might have been an attempt to locate. And the reaction of the arriving figures, which Morse described as neither welcome nor alarm, but something that read as prepared acknowledgement, as if they had expected to arrive and had been expected to arrive. In 1982, 14 years later, Morse mentioned the cave at a linguistics conference in Tucson as an example of material that defied methodological categorization. A question she received from a colleague stayed with her. If the cartographic system was sophisticated but corresponded to no known tradition, what was it mapping? Morse said she did not know. The colleague said perhaps the more important question was from where the map was being made, not what it was mapping. Morse wrote this in her conference notebook and did not respond. Dorothy Hawkins retired from the Forest Service in 1978. Before she left, she produced an internal document for the district archive with precise coordinates and recommendation for access protection. In 1991, a bureaucratic reorganization resulted in the document being mistakenly catalogued as an inactive site file and essentially forgotten. In 2004, a rock art researcher named Michael Reed, 42 years old, professor at Utah State University, came across a reference to Park's 1967 article during a literature search. He tracked down Park, retired in Tucson at 85 years of age. Park confirmed that the cave existed and provided an approximate location. Reed then searched the district archive and found Hawkins's 1978 document with the precise coordinates. Reed visited in October of 2004. The cave was there. The paintings were there. He spent 4 days photographing with high-resolution digital equipment Park had not had. The photographs revealed detail no previous analysis had identified. In a section of the chamber ceiling that had received less attention because of difficulty of visual access, there were additional paintings different from those on the walls. Not cartography, not narrative, text, or what Reed identified as text, a structured sequence of symbols with a pattern of repetition consistent with a writing system. Reed sent the photographs to 2 linguists and 2 specialists in writing systems. All 4 confirmed independently that the sequence had the structural features of a writing system: regularity, controlled variation, the pattern that distinguishes communication systems from decorative art. None could identify the system. 1. Dr. Yuki Tanaka of Columbia University, a specialist in undeciphered writing systems, said in an email to Reed that the system shared no structural features with any documented writing system from any period or any region. Reed published an article in 2006 describing the cave with specific location this time. The Bureau of Land Management declared the site a special protection zone and restricted access to credentialed researchers. 4 academic expeditions visited between 2006 and 2019, using modern analytical technologies Park had not had. Accelerator mass spectrometry dating of trace organic matter in the pigments returned a result each laboratory verified multiple times before reporting because the result did not match expectation. The trace organic pigments dated to multiple overlapping periods, not one period, multiple. Components of different pigments in the same painting dated to epochs separated by centuries, as if the paintings had been added over a very extended period using pigments from different epochs, but in a way that created a unified composition that appeared as the work of a single period when examined visually. The explanation archaeologists considered was retouching, but the microstratigraphy analysis did not support retouching. The layers were not superimposed in the pattern retouching would have produced. Pigments of different dates were mixed within the same layer, within the same brush stroke in some cases. The only technical explanation the laboratory offered was that the mechanism of application was not consistent with any documented human technique, a formulation the chief archaeologist of the 2019 expedition described in private conversation as the laboratory's way of saying they did not know what had made these. The text on the ceiling remained undeciphered. Dorothy Hawkins died in 2011 in Cedar City at the age of 86. Bill Santos still lives in Moab, 80 years old, and in 2019 responded to a researcher's interview by confirming that what he had seen in 1966 had still not been explained to his satisfaction. James Park died in 2013. Patricia Morse died in 2009. The question Morse's colleague had formulated in 1982, from where the map was being made and not what it was mapping, remains without a published answer, but remains the question the most serious researchers of the cave consider the most important and the least approachable with available methodology. The cave is there. The paintings are there. The text on the ceiling is there. The blue-gray compound in the pigment that the laboratory of 1966 could not identify was verified by modern spectroscopy in 2015 and continues to correspond to no natural or artificial substance known in the material database consulted. Access is restricted, research continues, dating remains inconclusive, and the cartographic system on the walls, sophisticated, consistent, clearly functional as a system of representation, continues to map something no researcher has been able to identify, because the system it uses for mapping does not correspond to any system, any documented civilization developed for representing anything that documented civilizations considered worth mapping.